story of Upbuild began in a monastery. On our quest to understand ourselves more deeply, we recognize that it is our attachment to our egos, our identities, that gets in the way of being our true selves. This podcast will help you understand your ego. It will help you better understand your inner world, the motivations, insecurities, and emotions that affect your every action and relationship. Welcome to Upbuilding the Self. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Upbuilding the Self. This is Vipin, and I'm here with Rasanath. Rasanath, the last time you and I were together recording a podcast, I was able to interview you for this episode we did called From Investment Banker to Monk, Finding Your Calling. And I had shared with our audience that I had 100 more questions to ask you. So I've been waiting to have a second part to this conversation for the last 6 months. And I'm so excited that we get to do that right now.
Me too. There is so much to share. And also in speaking about it, I relive my time and I find myself so inspired to go back to those times because they still continue to add to my life. And it's very helpful for me to recount those times in my life as well. So thank you.
I feel so inspired hearing the stories from that time in your life. So thank you for sharing all of this. And just to connect it back, the fulcrum of the conversation last time was I really wanted to understand this decision that you had made to join the monastery, which I only realized many years later was such a huge transformational inflection point in your life, and one that would have been probably as difficult for you as it might have been for me. And so we talked about why would anyone give up a life of wealth on Wall Street to become a monk? And why would anyone who would eventually become a monk be motivated to work on Wall Street in the first place? And just reconciling those pieces, you shared a lot. I also got to hear from you about the key steps along the way that led to such a significant change in your life and in your career. We talked about the root causes of the existential crisis that you were trying to navigate and the challenges both inside and outside the monastery that you faced when you were trying to make that decision. You shared what it really meant to you, what it means to you to have freedom. And I think we closed with finding your calling. If we think about that as an audience, what are some specific ways to take steps in our own journeys to find our calling? That was maybe a little quick summary for those who haven't listened to that episode, From Investment Banker to Monk, Finding Your Calling. I would highly recommend it. And what I wanted to actually do today was demystify the monastery itself, your monastic experience. I always had ideas of what does that even mean to be a monk in a monastery? But I really want you to share with all of us what actually happens in the monastery and why is it such a transformative experience? Or why was it for you in particular?
Again, a very vast topic. And I would also say a very complex one at that, because those 4 years of spending all my time in the monastery, I was also at a very different junction in my life. So I must say that I didn't receive the most orthodox monastic training. Neither was my joining the monastery a very orthodox joining of the monastery. I lived in the monastery as I was working as an investment banker for 2 years. So there was a lot of overlap. And those 4 years are ridden with a lot of complex learnings that I'm happy to share.
Okay, good. I'm eager to hear. I keep thinking of the words, you checked yourself into the monastery. And I don't know what exactly that looks like, but what is the day you decide I'm going to become a monk? I guess it sounds like you were already living in the monastery before you became a full-time monk, but it's day one of you as a monk. How does it start?
So there are so many impressions that we have of what a monastery needs to look like or looks like from media that we consume. For me, the biggest thing about monastic life lies around exclusive dedication to a life of service. If you look at other monastic traditions, and if you look at the life of Mother Teresa, for example, who was a monk, the core principle in that life is living a life of exclusive dedicated service to God and through that then to humanity. And what you learn in a monastic setting is, what does that life of exclusive service look like? How do you reorder and restructure your life and through your life, your entire consciousness to be that instrument of service? Now, what happens in the process is, as much as there is a romantic notion, and this was definitely my experience, as much as there is this romantic notion of, I just want my life to be an exclusively dedicated service, I did not realize what kind of surrender it actually takes to do that. And to me, the monastic life can be understood in two ways. One is a space, a structure where everything is oriented towards a life of exclusive service. So if that's what they desire very deeply, then the entire lifestyle, all the currents are going in that direction. It really enables you to go in that direction. The other one is the teaching of surrender, which doesn't happen that easily. The monastic lifestyle, when you choose to be a part of the monastery, also teaches you what surrender is, which is not easy to learn. So it starts to shape you first into an instrument before it enables you as an instrument. So the monastery does both functions. It enables you to be a full instrument, but before it enables you, it actually shapes you. And that shaping process is not something that we think about, or at least I didn't think about. I knew about it. I had an intellectual understanding about it. But going in, that was the place where I think I benefited the most, is in being shaped.
Oh my gosh, there's a lot I want to unpack here. First, just repeat your encapsulation that monastic life is a life exclusively dedicated to service. And then you extended that service to God and through God to humanity at large. The first question I had when I heard that, I was thinking, what is the transition like from, and I mean, in your case, it was extreme, right? You're working as an investment banker on Wall Street. So I understand that some people consider that client service. It's a very different definition of service than the one that you're talking about here. And then you started talking about shaping. That can be quite jarring to move from your typical material conditioning to a transition where you're dedicating your life to service. How do they prepare you to do that? What is that shaping?
First of all, starting with what you just said, how do they prepare you to do that? There was no real preparation. The only thing I can say that worked as preparation is the 2 years that I spent in the monastery while I was also working as an investment banker.
So you're getting a taste. And that might have not happened for everyone. You had that opportunity because of the situation that you
And
created.
Hari had that opportunity as he moved from the film industry into the monastery. So there was this space that we and the monastery had intentionally started to create at that time, where people who were really considering or who were attracted to the monastic way of life had the opportunity to actually taste both. And that phase is so important, so critical, because we have this romantic notion. I know a lot of people who come into the monastery as a way of escaping the harsh realities of the material world, because then the monastery it doesn't really serve its purpose. It becomes an escapism for not having to deal with, well, I don't think I can make it in the world. I would just come to the monastery because I get boarding. So first of all, for people joining the monastery, and I've seen people who unconsciously have come with that spirit to the monastery too. And then for people from the outside who also think about monks as escapists, I had that experience as well. And they're not entirely wrong. But for me, that phase where the monastery was my home and Wall Street was my day and night job in many ways, So does the transition steps, where I had to intentionally make the choice that this is what I wanted to do with my life. And the same is true for our other partner, Hari Prasad. And that choice, making that choice, is a very important thing. It's like when you enter specifically a situation like the monastery, it's important for you to know what you're signing up for. And even then, you don't fully know. But at least you have reached a place where you can intentionally make the choice of stepping into a current that you still don't fully understand, but you're very deeply called to participate in. And that choice is very intentional. So that transition steps where I was fully aware of what the daily schedule looked like. I was fully aware of the rigors of monastic life.
What I'm hearing is, and this makes a lot of sense, that there are various motivations that can be there for one to join a monastery. And the motivations that you're entering with have a profound impact on your experience, obviously, and the experience of all the monks that you're surrounded by as well. And one of the ways that the monastery was helping people to clarify their motivations is sort of an internship process. You were an intern, you were an apprentice, and you live and you're getting a taste. And you're like, let me not create any false illusions on what is going to happen in this place. And then let me see if I'm ready to take the next step of, okay, do I feel more enthusiastic about living monastic life or less? So that is very helpful. And where I wanted to go is the daily schedule. So let's get very specific about what happens in the monastery.
So before I start on the schedule, I just wanted to say where the real crux of the decision to join the monastery is so challenging is when you have to relinquish all your identities outside in the material world. Now, what happens is until that time, you look at the lifestyle of a monk, and all of that is pretty good. You still have your identity in the outside world. At least for me, I was still working as a banker, and I could still do the practices of monastic life. But where it comes to really, and this is the first crux of surrender, is are you willing to relinquish all the identities that you've had and you've cherished for such a long time to just be a monk?
What does that even mean, to relinquish all your identities?
Being a monk, and as I said, exclusive service to God and through God to humanity. There are so many other identities that I've walked into the monastery with. Banker was definitely a big part. And through the banker notion, then came the entire thing about success in the material world and an identity around success. Identity around family was the other big part. I'm very close to my family. And one of the biggest challenges for me in making this decision was to then be able to say, well, I'm no longer identified with that part of my life as much as I have been. And monastic life, in some ways, is separating yourself from all of those roles and responsibilities and also facilities that come with identifying as a part of a bigger family. The third is, and this is also a big thing, an intimate relationship with a potential partner that you would want to spend life with, and everything that comes with that, right? And essentially, at least the way I joined was thinking that this is something that I would do for the rest of my life. So closing the doors on a romantic relationship, which is pretty significant and hard. All of those identities you're saying, okay, I'm bidding farewell to in all ways. And that turning point, that learning how to come to that place where you willingly relinquish all of those identities is a very crucial learning of surrender.
How did you do that?
It took time. I had to consciously look at all of those identities and all the ways in which those identities were serving me and my attachments to those identities. And all the stories that I was telling myself as justification to keep those identities alive. And I had to really take a very hard, honest look at all of that. And then be able to see how they were coming in the way of my exclusive dedication to serving God and through that serve humanity. And it was not easy at all. those attachments are very real. And during that time, there were a lot of conversations with people who had done this, and a lot of prayer to show the way. How should I do this? How can I do this? Am I even capable of doing this? And spending a lot of time in prayer.
I would imagine that some of those identities that you're mentioning are more obvious that have to be given up. Like you're no longer working in an investment bank. Just like if you were to transition from one job to another, you're changing that identity. So you're now taking on a new sort of quote unquote profession as a monk. But then there are other identities that I think it's less clear that you need to give up in order to live a life dedicated to service. So your identity as a son or as a brother, what's so critical about you surrendering those identities in order to live your monastic purpose?
Great question. My identity as a son, let's just focus on that for a little bit. My identity as a son brought with it a sense of responsibility to my parents, which I still carry till date. But especially at that time, and as I mentioned earlier, I'm very close to my family. And in the West, it's a little different because there are other identities that can be a lot more stronger in the West, because people usually in the West, at least, leave their families at a certain point in time. Those bonds are not as strong as perhaps a bond with a romantic partner might be. But growing up in a very strong family-oriented environment, that identity of a son, and a responsible son at that, was a very, very big thing for me. It almost defined my notion of living a successful life. And one of the biggest things that was in it was I'm a very responsible son. And becoming a monk, for me, was letting down my parents in a big way, and the expectations that they had on me, about me. To just leave a highly successful job and join a monastery was heartbreaking for them. They invested so much of their time and energy in me, not because they wanted me to be the most wealthiest man in the world and then they could partake of that. That was not the intent, but to see their son living a good life, living a life where we have so significantly contributed to the success and just the happiness around that. I just took that away from them by signing up for a life of voluntary poverty, right? That was a big part. The second part was also like my sense of responsibility towards everything that they had contributed to my life, and repaying that to them as they're getting older by taking care of them and providing for them. All of that came with that identity as a son. And in making this choice of joining the monastery, I essentially relinquished that entire relationship from a point of view of like, well, my life right now from this point on is exclusively dedicated to serving God and serving humanity. And so these bodily connections around me being your son, you being my mother or father, those no longer create equations of responsibility in the same way that it did before. And that was the shift. So one of the ways in which it manifested was I didn't call my parents for several weeks in a stretch. And even when I called them, I used to call them for 5 minutes as a way of like assuring them so that it minimized their suffering in some way. But that was it.
And you did that for yourself, for them? Were you trying to convey to them the difference in the relationship now? Or are you trying to also, in your own process of detachment, trying to limit yourself into how often you spoke to them? Or is it because your schedule was so rigorous that you didn't have time beyond that?
I think it was both. I think a big part of that was, and this is where I said it's starting to prepare you for a much bigger life of surrender. And the preparation is the formal parts of it, where you have to pull back. Because the more you stay engaged in those relationships, the more they reinforce those identifications. So for me, a big part of this was actually like really dialing back on those identifications. And that was what this was. And it was not that I did not miss them, right? And this was not easy. I did miss them. And then also recognizing that this is what I have to do to be able to, I guess, serve a much bigger family. It's the best way I can put it. I was joining a much bigger family. And that basically would mean looking at the world the way God looks at the world, which is this entire world is the family of God, right? And that's not an easy transition to make because our bodily connections have such a strong hold on us. And it extends in many ways, right? Family, community, country, the boundaries that we have created. This is mine, this is yours. But really learning how to look at this world through the eyes of God, where those boundaries actually have to fall by the wayside. And this was the starting place for me.
I'm going to launch into one thing I want to hear from you. When you think about surrender and what helped you in that process, take us into one experience that was part of your monastic training that was probably the most influential in helping you in that process of relinquishing identities and surrendering yourself to this life dedicated to service.
So the biggest factor, I would almost say like a current, an irresistible current that actually pulled me in this direction, was the experience of being with my teacher, my guru, Rasanath Swami, who is a lifelong monk. What I experienced was this unconditional love that I consistently experienced in his presence. And I had known him up until that point in time when I joined the monastery. I'd already known him for 10 years, 11 years, actually. The consistency of that experience of unconditional love. And not just me, I saw that same kind of love in other people experiencing him. I also saw how people who criticized him also experienced the same kind of love from him. I hadn't experienced anything like that.
Well, what about from your own parents? As you think about and you had a particularly close relationship with your parents. And so I know that when you're saying you can observe it in others, and that's a big piece, but as it relates to just yourself, how is that unconditional love you experienced from Rasanath Swami distinct from what you've experienced in your family?
It's very hard to put it in words, but what I felt was that for my parents, there was the bodily connection, like I was their son, and that was a very big part of the connection itself. What I felt from Rasanath Swami is it didn't matter. It didn't matter. My success didn't matter. And the consistency of that experience, and it was not something, I experienced this just last week being in the presence of Rasanath Swami. I was dropping him off at the Bhakti Center, which is where I was a monk for a very long time. And there was this person who sells belts, and he has been there since like I was a monk. And, he sits outside just like he has this belt stall. And Rasanath Swami every time takes time to speak to him and ask him how he's doing. And their exchange is just so rich. And, I've seen him have similar conversations with people in a cab, like the cab driver. And to me, that experience was just so powerful. And what I realized was that here is a person who experiences what it means to actually be an instrument exclusively in the hands of God.
So you're saying their unconditional love that you experienced in him transcended any bodily connections or conceptions. And even as you're giving these two examples, I think what's different about that than someone who's just a really nice person?
The only thing I can say is you have to experience it to know it. And I think I have brought this example several times before, that there is a difference between a real diamond versus a fake one. Although it can look very similar, the cuts may still be the same. There is a big difference.
And you're not saying the nice person is being
fake. No,
but you're saying that it's the unconditional love is different from just being a nice person.
Very different. And to me, that was the experience. And then it showed me the possibility of what one can become. And that possibility, after having experienced it repeatedly, that possibility was just irresistible. Why can't I do that with my life? Right. And that pull was just so strong. And I feel fortunate that it still continues to be strong despite not personally being in the monastery, which is a whole other story we can talk about. That pull is what really got me through this. And I would really hope that everybody experiences what it means to be in the presence of someone who is so self-realized.
So when you think about surrender and relinquishing identities, what really gave you the motivation is being in the presence of someone like that, experiencing yourself in that person's presence, experiencing and seeing the experience of others, and that creating a deep sense of purpose for your own life, not only to experience that, but to have that impact on humanity.
That's right. That's it.
Okay, Rasanath, I really want to understand, and I want our whole community to understand, what was life like in the monastery? Can you take us into that?
When I speak about or share with people that I lived in a monastery, people ask me where. And it's an unusual response when I say it was in New York City in the Lower East Side. And I think the setting of the monastery is very interesting. It's not something that we decided intentionally, in the sense we were looking for a space in New York because we wanted to serve the New York community. Given the stress, given the pressures that people experience in New York, we felt that the monastery will be like an oasis in New York City. But the location was something that the universe guided us to. We were right on First Avenue between First and Second Street, next to a tattoo parlor. And then right opposite to the monastery used to be a drag queen cabaret called Lucky Cheng's. So you can imagine the setting. And First Avenue is very, very noisy. When I was doing some research at that time, it had the third highest foot traffic in New York, in the entire city of New York. So it was just a very noisy place. And Thursday nights and Friday nights used to be extremely chaotic, given how many bars there are in that location. So just the setting itself was very unusual for a monastery to be in.
You said when we were deciding, was the monastery already there when you joined, or were you one of the initial people deciding the location of the monastery?
The monastery was in Manhattan, but it was just a few monks living in an apartment. So it just felt like a regular apartment and monks living in a regular apartment. But the broader vision of how to build an entire center.
You were part of that.
Yeah. Again, not intentionally, just happened to be there at that time and happened to get a chance to participate in this pioneering work, so to say. And the way we got the building, that's a whole other story. But you just see how those experiences really helped me understand that there were forces way beyond my control that were actually moving us in a certain direction. And so here we were on First Avenue between First and Second Street, 25 First Avenue is the address. 6-story building that used to be a plumbing warehouse. So it was just this really narrow, very narrow building, a very old building, probably 80 years old at that time when we got it in 2005. In by no means fully ideal from a point of view of what we wanted to create. And yet we were so excited about being there because we didn't have anything. And this building just came to us in a very miraculous way.
And who is us right now?
In 2005, I was still working in the banking world at that time. And I had just made the monastery my home. 2006, I had just made the monastery my home. And it was about 9 months. It really felt like an intimate family at that time, especially when we moved into a 6-story building, because now suddenly the space was much bigger and there were a few people.
6 stories for 9 months seems like a lot of space per month.
Yes, but not all of the spaces could be used. When we first got the property, it was disputed property. So four of the floors were still under legal disputes by the previous owners. It was a very complicated situation. And we still took over the building because we were hoping that over time we would be able to peacefully resolve the conflict. And hopefully we can get all the residents to move out in a way that was mutually beneficial. So the daily schedule, it started very early. And at a certain point in time, I think it was at the peak of how many monks lived with us, there were 21 monks and a bunch of residents who were living in the building who were helping us with the project of building a spiritual cultural center in Manhattan. So at one point in time, there were 36 people residing in the building. So as far as the monastery was concerned, the monastery was on the fifth and the sixth floors of the building. So we were at the top. So our morning started together with what you call kirtan. Kirtan is spiritual singing and chanting with musical instruments. It's a very beautiful, joyful experience. And all the monks congregated every morning, and some of the other building residents too came, and that started at 5 a.m. So for us to have taken a shower and be ready meant that around 3:45, 3:30, 3:45 is when the first monk had to wake up, take a shower. And we only had two bathrooms between two floors. And it used to be this real funny assessment in the morning, especially for someone like me who was used to being in queues, traveling before to actually see, well, which queue is the shortest and join that queue. The morning used to be sort of a rush to get there at 5 a.m. And different monks had like different waking up times, 3:30, 3:45, 4 o'clock, and brushing our teeth, taking a shower, putting on our clothes, our monastic robes, and then coming downstairs to the second floor for our kirtan. That was from 5 to 5:30. And then at 5:30, we used to meditate together, japa meditation together. And all the monks used to sit in circles of 3 or 4 across the main temple room. The idea was to create a spirit of being together in this process and supporting each other, because when you wake up early, day in and day out, sometimes during your meditation, you would fall asleep. And so when you had a fellow monk who was actually there doing the meditation with you, and my experience is just touching me to wake me up as I was falling asleep, to bring back my mind to the process of meditation. And that spirit of togetherness, but also that spirit of fighting the mind, to be in the meditation for 2 hours at a stretch, was intense, but extraordinarily character building, I would say. And sometimes when you fall asleep and somebody woke you up, first of all, you're being disturbed. The second part is somebody actually caught you falling asleep. And you have to deal with your ego arising, your defensiveness, your sense of resignation, all of that arising, and to then continue chanting japa and actually feel a sense of gratitude for the support that you're receiving. It forced us to look at our own lives from a much deeper place.
The image of someone noticing that you might be nodding off and just giving you a touch or a nudge actually brings up a lot of sweetness. I can imagine myself in that situation and responding as if I wasn't asleep. You didn't need to touch me. I'm fully engaged. So I appreciate that. And you mentioned japa. So can you just say, what is japa and what was the purpose of that japa?
The idea of japa meditation is to focus on the names of God. The process of japa, or mantra meditation, as it's called. Mantra, if you break down the Sanskrit, mantra comes from the word manatrayate iti in Sanskrit. Manas means the mind, and trayate means that which connects the mind to a higher reality. So when the mantra that we chant is Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Ram Ram, Hare Hare. And we keep repeating that on rosary beads. And we chant it in a way that it's audible just to us. And so each person in the circle is chanting at their own pace. But at the same time, you're very attentively listening to the sound vibrations. The sound vibrations have a quality to them where, just like how when we are sleeping, and if we have to wake up in the morning, the only thing that can truly wake us up, sometimes we can sleep through it, but the hope of waking us up is through an alarm clock, because sound has the capacity to penetrate through the deepest layers of our consciousness. And so mantra meditation is meditating on spiritual sound vibrations, which has a very deep effect on our consciousness, especially when we connect directly to the names of God.
So I think we'll understand more about how this service manifests itself in life in the monastery as we come back to sort of what happens in the monastery. So essentially where you've brought us so far is you wake up at between 4 and 5, you're queuing, showering, brushing your teeth. 5 o'clock, you sit down for kirtan, which is musical chanting. And at 5:30, you go into your japa meditation for 2 hours. So 7:30, and now what happens?
7:30, we have a talk from one of the scriptures. Usually there is a schedule for the talk. We are each rotating, giving a talk, and it's a spiritual discussion, conversation around the scripture. So we take one verse, and one person is leading the discussion. That is one thing that I looked forward to every day, because the conversations used to be so rich. Different people have different styles of leading and facilitating a conversation. And there were some people that I just like, the kind of depth that they went to unpacking certain things just was so incredibly enriching of my own spiritual journey.
Beautiful. And so it sounds like that was a combination, or some might have been more lecture oriented and some were more discussion based, or they're always both components?
There were both components. And I think based on how much time a particular monk had spent really working on themselves, you used to see that it just reflected through in what they shared. It came from a place of realization.
Personal realization, yeah.
Very personal realization. Also sharing their own backstories to how they came to monastic life, their own spiritual seeking. And while we all lived together, there were so many nuances that sometimes you could discover in these. Oh, I didn't know. I didn't know that about you. Wow, that just changes what I had thought. There's just so much there when people share from a place of realization and from their own personal lives.
Yeah, yeah. There's on one hand, such intimacy, but there's infinite stories that are there. It was so funny because I was in a coaching session yesterday with someone who I've been working with for 4 years now. And he shared with me a couple of things that I thought, even after 4 years of really intimate conversations every 2 weeks, I thought there's so much more I don't know about this person. That's fascinating. So I can just imagine what that's like in a monastery of 21 monks.
It was so fascinating. And here's the complexity, because when you're living with 21 people across 2 floors with no door to close behind you, and each person bringing their own habits and, dare I say, conditionings to the monastic life, peculiarities, all of that, you tend to form an opinion about people. There's certain people that trigger you consistently, even within the monastery. And then you are sitting in this in this audience listening to them speak, and suddenly you realize, wow, we all got here, and the way God has brought us here together, and the role that God played in each of our lives to bring us to the monastery is so unique. And suddenly your respect and love for the other person, it just brings that back. And you also realize that things that you're triggered by are, in the context of everything that you know about the other person, they're actually small.
It sounds like you're able to view other people from a higher place in connection with, as you were saying before, being all sort of brothers and sisters in humanity and
Yes.
part and parcel of a larger divine presence.
And also because now you know very unique. So that's one general understanding. But also when you hear the stories of people in the monastery, you realize how specifically they were brought, right? And it's so each person's story is so different, so unique.
Yeah, yeah. This is why I want to keep unpacking your story, because I think there's so much to be gained from that, exactly as you're saying. Wonderful.
Yeah. And then after the talk, then there used to be another kirtan. And then we used to all take breakfast together. Now, the process of eating was such a ceremonious process. There would be one monk who would cook breakfast, and different monks would take turns in different days.
So that monk would be cooking while the kirtan was happening, or
Even when the discussion was going on.
they would peel off after the japa meditation, prepare breakfast for 21 monks. And maybe also, what about the other 15 people who were also
Yeah, so it used to be for around 35,
breakfast
40
for
people.
everybody in the building? And I guess they had to learn to cook somewhere.
Yeah, it was all training that used to happen. So the more
That was part
experienced
of the
monks
monastic training.
Yes, yes. So it used to be that when people are being trained, then two people go up to cook. So one person being trained, the other person who has more experience. And then over time, then the person who was being trained used to start cooking by himself.
Amazing. Okay. These are like very important life lessons that people are gaining.
And yeah, and then it's also how we still bring our preferences to the monastery. So, certain people's cooking used to be so tasty, so delicious, and certain others who are still in training, sometimes things burn, and all of that. And again, it's something that you have to confront about your own set of choices, where you have to learn how to look at everything the same way. There's a verse in the Bhagavad Gita, which is what the Bhakti tradition is based on, where a self-realized soul looks at every circumstance and every living entity the same way. It doesn't look at the body, but looks at the spiritual spark, and looks at all circumstances in the same way as pushing one to go closer to God. It's not that we deliberately need to take on the austerity, but when it comes, you have to learn how to accept it, and also at the same time provide feedback so that next time the cook who cook can actually do better. So all of this you could see during the breakfast time, but also it's such a joyous process of sitting together, talking. Sometimes the discussion that started during the scheduled time would continue, which was very enriching again. It was a very joyous process very ceremonious process of taking breakfast. And then right after that was the cleaning of the entire monastery. So all the monks used to take different parts of the building and clean different floors.
Every day you would do that?
Every day. And again, the symbolic idea of the cleaning process was to clean our hearts. And the people who got the opportunity to clean the toilets every day, it was a very purifying experience. Of course, we used to change the routine in the sense, for a month, one person would clean one specific place, and then, somebody else used to come to that same place. So there was change in routine. And that would be about 45 minutes to an hour.
So are you saying that cleaning the toilets was a job that people looked forward to because they knew it was purifying, or it was something you didn't look forward to, but you knew it was good for you because it was purifying?
Both, right? And that's what makes it so interesting. So you need to come into it with a certain spirit of, well, this is hard, but this is actually it's a very purifying experience for me.
The purification is in the humbling of oneself.
In the humbling, and it was not just the toilets. There were a few other places in the building that were of common use, where the more you're trying to organize sometimes, then you see when people use the place, they leave it disorganized. And then you have to deal with the frustration of and then you would know who those people are. And you would see the frustration rising up, and you have to look at it. And that doesn't mean you don't talk to those individuals because it's in the service of everybody.
Right. Right.
But then, the spirit that you bring into the conversation, only and mainly because you are the person who's dealing with it at that time, is also something that we have to take note of. And in the Bhakti tradition, the spirit of cleaning was cleaning our hearts. And there was something about not doing it, but being able to put our hearts into the cleaning as a way to serve the monastery so that somebody else who then uses it feels like, this is it's so clean and, nice. The building was also considered, every part of the building was considered a very sacred place because ultimately it was all for the service of God. So we wanted to keep it spick and span because we also wanted that place to be an oasis for the city. So anybody who came in, the well-known saying, cleanliness is next to godliness. We took it very, very seriously. And so here is a place where internal cleanliness and external cleanliness were happening at the same time. We were cleaning our hearts as we were cleaning the monastic building. And then after that, we took a little nap. So everybody got a chance we all had our spots, put our sleeping bags down, and we took a nap, 45 minutes to an hour. And then it was collective study time, where we used to engage with the scriptures individually. So different people were engaging with different scriptures, but it was like deep study of the scripture. And then coming together for a conversation, discussion at the end of the study time. So 1 hour of study time followed by half an hour of discussion. And during that time, in the morning and during that time, 2 people used to cook lunch. And the lunch was usually like 5-6 items. And the lunch, we had to also cook lunch for more than 40 people because some of the monks used to run cooking classes in universities. NYU and Columbia, a few monks would teach cooking programs, cooking classes. So the cook had to cook for at least like some people who used to come for the cooking classes. So, 60, sometimes 60, 65, 70 people you're cooking for in the afternoon. So it was a full operation. We had an industrial sized kitchen with like all the burners going full. So in the summer, it used to be really hot. And you're standing over the stove, sweating, wiping yourself as you're continuing to cook. And then the cooking also entailed that we leave the kitchen very clean. So like we cook, we wash the pots, and we leave the kitchen spick and span afterwards. So it was a full operation. So the monks who were cooking didn't clean. So that started at around 9:30, and the cooking went all the way until 1 o'clock. So it's 3.5 hours, sometimes 4 hours, 4-hour operation. And then in the afternoon, then again, you would get some personal time, get some time to rest. And some of the monks went out, and this was a very important activity. Some of the monks went out on distributing spiritual literature. And Hari Prasad can speak more to that. I was one person who was significantly petrified of that activity. And I also, I guess, the monks in the monastery also knew that if I did that for a long time, I wouldn't survive. So they kindly engaged me in activities that were more suited to my own nature, which was to manage the building and set up structures and manage the finances, etc. So that's something that I did during the afternoons. And while some of the monks went to distributing spiritual literature, and Hari Prasad will be able to share with you amazing experiences of being able to do that. And so many stories there.
Well, I will ask him about it. I will ask him
that. And then in the evening, different monks had different services. So as I was telling you, the cooking classes in the universities, sometimes teaching the Bhagavad Gita in universities, sometimes teaching Bhagavad Gita in the homes of people. It was a very special time. Very special time. I keep those memories very, very close.
What struck me about that was when you and I had met in 2011, right? And we met for the first time, and you were sharing
2010, October 2010.
Yeah, 2010. You're right. Sorry. And you were sharing that you had just started teaching this class on the Bhagavad Gita, and it was a text that I had always wanted to study, but had never opened at that point. And I remember we had already missed the beginning of the class, and I had asked if you would ever consider teaching a few of us at our home. And you were so enthusiastic about doing that. And you'd shared that that was really part of your service. That was part of your purpose and your work in the monastery, was to share the wisdom of these scriptures with others. And so you happily came to our house every Tuesday evening. And that was it was a very, very special hour and a half that we spent together reading, philosophizing, understanding.
Yeah, very, very special time.
I mean, and that is a large part why I'm here today, I would say.
I guess going back to what I shared, God has attracted every person in a very unique way, and these stories are very, very powerful. So then after that, then we come back to the monastery around 8 o'clock. There used to be, getting together. Sometimes we used to have milk at night, just hot milk, and what was left over from lunch. Some monks ate, some monks didn't eat. They just had milk. And then lights out policy at 10 o'clock. We used to wash our clothes with our own hands and then dry our clothes on the railings. And then at 10 between 10 and 10:30, lights off.
Thank you for taking us through your schedule, your life in the monastery. When you reflect on that schedule, what was the biggest thing that you took away from living that life for 4 or 5 years, day in and day out, day in and day out?
Discipline, not just of habits, but the mind. And we don't actually understand how undisciplined the mind is until it's tested. And through that testing, you build humility, which is such an important learning. You learn what service actually means, what it means to truly serve from your heart, despite trying conditions, what it means to really show up to serve. You learn how to live simply, which means even when entitlement shows up, you recognize that this is just the ego feeling entitled. You learn how to share your heart, to live with 21 monks. And I can speak specifically to men. We're not very good at truly sharing our hearts. And that's something that we learned. But when we can do that, it goes so much deeper. So that's something that we learned was very valuable. The spirit of brotherhood really came out of that, knowing that we were in the trenches together. It was a very powerful experience. So these are the few amongst many things that I gained in the monastery that I'm still carrying with me into my life.
Thank you. I can say that just having gotten to know you over the last 12 years, something that I would have thought was meant for a very small slice of the population, I have now felt like, wow, everyone could really benefit from some monastic training. And in fact, I wish there are times where I think I would never have done this in my 20s, no chance. But I wish that somehow I would have had an experience like that. And I would say, what we sometimes we talk about, what we're trying to do at Upbuild is actually bring the monastery out into the world. And so I think my wife Kruti would say, when I joined Upbuild, when I joined you guys, that this was me trying to vicariously become a monk. And I think that I haven't had monastic training in the way that you've described, but the experience of Upbuild is maybe for me in this life the closest approximation that I can get to that. And it has been, all of the things that you just shared and what you got out of it. I'm experiencing a little glimpses of that, and I'm so appreciative.
Thank you. Thank you for saying that. That's our desire, and it's never too late.
Thank you, Rasanath. Thank you for this wonderful conversation and journey, and
thank you,
I'm looking forward to many more.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Upbuilding the Self. Upbuild is a leadership development company that offers workshops, coaching, and other services to help you on the path towards being your best self, free from the shackles of the ego. To learn more about our work, visit our website, upbuild.com, and sign up for our newsletter to gain access to podcasts, reflections, and upcoming events. If you enjoyed this episode, please go to iTunes to leave us a review so that others can find and benefit from the podcast. We look forward to being with you again next time.